Ars Nouveau is one of modded Minecraft's most popular magic mods, now with over 100 million downloads on CurseForge. It has custom spells, living automation, storage, rituals, bosses, world generation, and even add-on support that lets spells act like machines. So in this episode of Mod Labs, we're putting Ars Nouveau to the test to see just how far one magic mod can actually go. So if we're trying to figure out whether Ars Nouveau might be Minecraft's most complete magic mod, we should probably start with the part that pretty much everyone knows it for, and that's the spells. And the easiest way to explain them is probably just to build one. Any spell needs a spellbook, starting with the novice tier. By default, pressing C will open up the spellbook UI. Let's start with something easy. Right now, the spell is about as simple as it gets. Projectile sends the spell forward, and break tells it what to do when it lands. So congratulations, we've invented a magical pickaxe that works from a distance. Not exactly world-changing yet, but this is just a foundation. Now let's make it a little better. If we add Amplify, the same spell becomes stronger. Now break can handle tougher blocks like obsidian, essentially as if we were using a diamond pickaxe over an iron one. And then we can take things a step further by adding a component like item pickup, which instead of just dropping the broken block on the ground, instead directs it straight into your inventory. Or even something more powerful like AoE, which increases the breaking size, allowing you to break multiple blocks at once. And even this extremely useful spell still just scratches the surface of what you can do. At the basic level, there are three major components of a spell. The first being the form, which decides how the spell is delivered. So in this case, projectile fired the spell forward, or alternatively, touch applies it right in front of you, or self, which would apply it directly to your player. The second component, the effect, decides what the spell actually does. Break mines, harm damages, conjure mage light places a light source, and leap throws things into the air, which when combined with self makes a nice little yeet spell. Very fun and useful for transportation, and also a bit of a liability. Augments can then be added into the chain to modify how the spell behaves. They can make an effect stronger, larger, longer lasting, or more precise, which will become extremely important when we start looking at more complex spells and eventually automation. But ours doesn't stop at those three components. You'll also start running into more advanced spell logic, like filters that control what a spell is allowed to affect, or contingencies that allow you to store a spell and automatically cast it when a specific trigger condition is met. And there are some extremely powerful and useful glyphs out there, but already you may notice our first problem. The Novice Spellbook only gets us so far. It gives us access to tier 1 glyphs, which is enough to learn the system, but not enough to show what ours is fully capable of. And instead, we have a whole bunch of grayed out glyphs, which we can't seem to add to our spells. To unlock those higher tier glyphs, we need higher tier spellbooks. The Mage's Spellbook opens up tier 2, and the Archmage Spellbook opens up tier 3. And each of those tier upgrades require components from the Ars progression chains that we'll take a look at later in this video. But on top of the spellbook, you'll also need a way to learn each of these glyphs, since when you first start your world, your book will look a little more like this. So how do you discover glyphs in the first place? Well, the main way is the scribe's table. Use your spellbook on the table, pick the glyph you want, and then provide the required items and experience. Once the table creates the glyph, you can right click it to learn that glyph permanently. And that makes spell progression feel much more connected to the rest of the game. You need resources and XP, but you also need to decide what kind of spells you want to invest in first. Depending on the mod pack, crafting is not always the only path either. Our structures, like arcane libraries, can contain some unidentified glyphs, and some packs may use structure loot to reward exploration, with glyphs, spell-related items, or other Ars progressional components. So now with a max tier spellbook and all the glyphs unlocked, we can start to look at some higher tier spells. And to be honest, this system has so much complexity and opportunity that there is no way we could cover every single useful spell, unless this was a 100-hour long video. But we can take a look at some of my favorites. The first is an upgraded version of our yeet spell from earlier. By adding an Amplify, the spell can launch us further into the air. And then by adding Glide and Extend, we can essentially mimic Elytra Flight to make long distance travel much easier. Next is a combat example, because our spells aren't limited to just tools and movement. The spell starts with Projectile, then Summon Undead creates skeleton allies at that spot. But the fun part is how the augments change the summon. Split increases the number of skeletons, Pierce changes them towards bow using skeletons, and Amplify makes those summons stronger. So instead of just firing a damage spell myself, I could summon a temporary squad of magical archers to fight for me. With runes, filters, and other logic-focused glyphs, spells can start acting less like one-time casts and start moving towards magical automation. But of course, the stronger your spells get, the more mana they start demanding. So Ars gives us a few ways to scale that up. Mage armor is a big part of that, because it gives Ars a dedicated armor path instead of forcing you to treat magic like something separate from your gear. The biggest upside of the mage armor is the increased mana regen that comes along with it, with higher levels coming along with the higher tiers of the armor. But of course, mana boost and mana regen are common enchants that if found or crafted can be put on any gear, either from vanilla or even from other mods. Now, all the spells we've seen so far are really just the starting point. Later in this video, we'll look at how spells can be automated and how add-on mods can add ridiculously useful glyphs that let Ars work alongside other major mods. If Ars Nouveau stopped here, it would already be a very good spellcasting mod. The glyph system alone gives it a ridiculous amount of flexibility. But the second spells need to leave my spellbook and start powering machines or automation, mana is not enough. For that, Ars needs a different kind of power, or in this case, source. Source is basically the magical fuel of Ars, and it powers a lot of the mod's larger systems. The main way to store a source is in source jars, which is significantly different from mana, which is what we use to cast spells from the spellbook. Source instead is the external power system that lets Ars run machines, rituals, helpers, and automation. And one of the first places source starts feeling extremely valuable is the enchanting apparatus. This is one of Ars Nouveau's main crafting systems. You place items on nearby pedestals, put the main item on the apparatus, provide source if the recipe needs it, and the apparatus completes the craft. But the main part I really want to highlight is enchanting, because Ars can use the enchanting apparatus to apply or upgrade specific enchantments directly. In vanilla Minecraft, getting perfect enchants usually means re-rolling enchantment tables, trading with villagers, breaking lecterns, replacing lecterns, checking trades, and slowly losing your mind because this librarian refuses to sell that mending book that you actually want. Ars gives us a much more direct route. Instead of hoping the game gives me the right enchantment, I can build towards it with items and source. So I guess let's take a look at how you get source in the first place. And I don't really want to turn this into a full source farm tutorial because we have so much more interesting things to get to, but the basics are still important. To generate source, you use source links. Different source links create source from different types of activity or resources, like the agronomic source link, which works from nearby crop and tree growth. The mycelial source link consumes edible items like source berries, and the vitalic source link can generate source from mob deaths, animal breeding, and even baby animals being close by. And of course, because this is modded Minecraft, mod packs can adjust what source generation looks like, which source links are available, or how those systems fit into the pack's progression. But without going too far into the weeds, the high-level loop is pretty simple. Something happens in the world and a source link converts that into source, and then that source gets stored in a jar. And most of the time, our systems are designed to pull source from nearby jars, which makes the setup pretty easy. But once we have source, of course, we'll also need a way to move it. Source relays lets you transfer source between jars over much longer distances, which means you don't need a bunch of source links sitting in the exact same room where you need source to get used. That's also where you'll start to see the need for the Dominion wand, basically the main linking tool used across the rest of the mod. With more advanced relays like splitter relays or warper relays, you can start supporting larger source networks instead of just one jar next to one machine. At first, source is mostly going to show up in crafting with the apparatus, but eventually the imbuement chamber can use source to drastically increase crafting speed for magical components. But the main reason source matters is not just crafting speed. Source is what lets Ars scale. It can power spell turrets, which means spells don't always have to be cast by hand. It can power some magical helpers, which we'll look at in a minute. It can fuel rituals, which is where Ars will start affecting the world around us with effects or automated systems. And in some of the coolest cases, source can even help create land. We'll come back to all of that properly when we talk about rituals, because Conjure Islands definitely deserve more than a 5-second mention. But one thing I should probably mention first is that there are technically two versions of source, the first being the version we already covered, and the second being its gem form. Source gems are a key resource and ingredient used to craft all kinds of different Ars components. Instead of being made with source links, it's instead made in the imbuement chamber by converting amethyst or lapis. And as you move deeper into Ars crafting, source gems and the different elemental essences become some of the reoccurring magical ingredients that tie the imbuement chamber, enchanting apparatus, and higher tier recipes together. Okay, so now that we've built up our source engine, we should probably take a look at what we can use that source for. And what better way to start than with some automation, or in this case, some friends. Where most mods would provide simple one-block machines or pipes, Ars takes a vastly different approach and instead gives us magical creatures. But before we start using them, we need to clear up something that had me a little bit confused at first. Ars uses 3 different creature-related items: tokens, sometimes called shards, charms, and bound scripts. Tokens or shards are usually the progression item. You get them by interacting with a wild creature or ritual in a specific way. For example, a wild Starbuncle will give you a Starbuncle token when provided with a gold nugget. These tokens or shards are what are used to craft charms, usually through the enchanting apparatus. And charms are what summon the working version of the creature into the world. So the simple version is, tokens help craft charms, charms summon the workers, and each worker has a very specific job. And the place that you use that charm usually tells you what that helper is meant to do. Let's start with the easiest one to understand. Every modded base eventually becomes an item transportation problem. You mine things, craft things, farm things, and suddenly items are everywhere. In a tech mod, this is where you'd start placing pipes, cables, conduits, hoppers, or who knows what else. Ars Nouveau has a very different answer: Starbuncles. To summon a Starbuncle worker, use the Starbuncle charm on the ground. And once summoned, Starbuncles can pick up nearby items, move items between inventories, and even harvest fully grown sourceberry bushes. So instead of building a pipeline, I can have this little guy physically run around the base and move items for me by using the Dominion wand. Is it the most industrial looking system in modded Minecraft? Maybe not. But is it significantly cuter than a hopper? Absolutely. But it's not just cute, it's useful. Starbuncles are perfect for early logistics, especially when you start giving them accessories, like a Wixie hat to allow them to transport potions, or depending on the add-on mods you have in the mod pack, you may even be able to provide a star battery allowing your squirrel to move power around. But of course, transportation is only one piece of the puzzle. The next one is crafting, and for this we get the Wixie. To summon a Wixie, the basic setup is to use a Wixie charm on a cauldron, and once it has access to source, the Wixie can automatically craft items for you. You tell it what item you want by using that item on the Wixie cauldron, or by placing items on nearby pedestals if you want to handle multiple recipes. Then once the Wixie has access to the required materials, either from nearby inventories or inventories that you bind with the Dominion wand, it starts doing the work. And this can get surprisingly flexible. Wixies can handle multiple recipes, automate potion crafting with potion jars, and if you sneak use a Wixie charm on an enchanting apparatus, you can even create a Wixie powered enchanting apparatus setup. But of course, automatic crafting isn't helpful if you don't have the resources to keep up with your new friends. So naturally, Ars gives a couple methods to generate resources much easier. To set up a Drygmy worker, use a Drygmy charm on mossy cobblestone, which creates the Drygmys henge. And then with the right setup, Drygmys can simulate drops from nearby animals, monsters, or mobs stored in containment jars, as if those mobs were slain without actually killing them. So instead of building a classic mob farm where everything gets pushed into a grinder, the Drygmy turns mob drops into something much more magical and of course a little more server friendly. You can put pretty much any mob you can think of into a containment jar, but of course fitting a mob into those little jars isn't quite as easy as right clicking. Instead, you'll need to execute a containment ritual, which we'll cover a little bit later in more detail. But once you start building your collection of jars, your happy Drygmy will get to work using source to simulate those mob drops for everything in its immediate area. Then there's the Whirlisprig, which handles the more nature-focused side of resource generation. Whirlisprigs are summoned by using a Whirlisprig charm on a flower, and they can produce natural materials based on the area around them. Much like real life, a productive Whirlisprig is a happy Whirlisprig, and their happiness is driven by a diverse habitat. So by giving our new friend a lush home full of all kinds of different crops, it'll start to use its source to simulate farming those resources and then placing them in storage next to their home block. And our last main friend for resources is the Amethyst Golem. You can summon anywhere using a charm, but will want to set a home block to some storage. The Golem will then look around for any budding blocks, especially amethyst, and not just help accelerate their growth, but also automatically harvest and drop the associated item into its home block, which is of course great for amethyst, but also for modded items like Certus quartz or even geors depending on the mod pack that you're playing. So now we have item movement, crafting, mob drop generation, and natural resource generation. But there's one charm-based system that I think is especially underused, which is unfortunate because I think it is by far the most useful. And it also solves Minecraft's biggest problem, storage. And of course, naturally, this is where players would rush towards something like AE2 or refined storage. But Ars Nouveau quietly has its own early storage solution, built around Bookwyrms. This is the storage lectern, and this thing is way more useful than it looks. The storage lectern can view, manage, and craft from multiple connected inventories. So instead of opening every chest one by one, I can connect these inventories to the lectern and access them through one interface. The connection is handled with the Dominion wand, and inventories can be linked from a decent distance away. Bookwyrm charms are then used on the storage lectern to increase the number of inventories that lectern can access. So Bookwyrms are not just a cute creature sitting next to a lectern. They're basically the magical librarians that upkeep your storage network. And no, this is not going to replace a fully upgraded AE2 setup, but in early or mid-game progression, especially in Skyblock style packs, this is huge, especially when paired with storage blocks like repositories or even storage doors that allow you to make some massive storage systems super early game that will probably last significantly longer than some of the other early storage options. Additionally, you can use items like the Enchanter's Eye, which can cast an inscribed spell remotely through a scry crystal. And if that spell is something like interact, you can use that remote cast to interact with the storage lectern, allowing you wireless access to your storage just like a wireless crafting terminal would in AE2. While I won't cover them all, there are a couple add-on mods out there that add additional helper friends, like the Flash Jack, which is basically a flying light source that follows you around as you explore, or even this little crabby guy that I used extensively in my Twitch playthrough of Enigmatic Skies. Everything we've looked at so far was mostly for the worker side, charms that summon creatures into the world to help run our base. But the third version, Familiars, are related, but instead for a separate spellbook system. To unlock a familiar, you perform the ritual of binding near the relevant entity to get a bound script. Then you use that bound script to learn the familiar into your spellbook. Once learned, that familiar becomes a companion that you can summon from the spellbook, usually giving you some type of bonus or utility. For example, the Starbuncle familiar isn't used for transporting items, but instead gives you some of those squirrel-like abilities by granting speed too. Additionally, if you give your Starbuncle familiar a gold nugget, it'll basically give you gold or X-ray for a short period of time. So now that we have spells, source, helpers, logistics, crafting, resources, storage, and familiars, there is another question. What happens when magic stops being handled by individual spells and starts being something that the world itself does for us? That is where rituals come in, and that's where we can finally come back to one of my personal favorite things that Ars can do. The best way to understand rituals is probably not by explaining them, but instead watching them in action. First, my absolute favorite, the Conjure Terrain rituals. All rituals start with a ritual brazier and a tablet. When you use that tablet on the brazier, it initializes the ritual. Then, before activating it, you can add any augment items that ritual supports. And if that ritual requires source, you'll need enough nearby before you right-click the brazier to actually start it. In this case, a full island will be built around the brazier. The basic plains version creates an island of grass and dirt and converts that area into a plains biome. By default, it generates with a radius of 7 blocks, but if you augment the ritual during the initialization stage with source gems, you can increase that radius and create a larger island. In a normal overworld, this might just feel like a cool trick, but in a skyblock or progression pack, this is pretty huge. Instead of having to build a bunch of platforms by hand, you can use these rituals to summon large areas, generate dirt, and even stack them on top of each other to make more complex islands. And the same idea applies to other island types. The Conjure Desert version creates sand and sandstone, and if augmented with terracotta, it can create a Badlands style island instead. That means a pack could gate sand, sandstone, cactus, biome resources, or entire progression steps behind magical rituals instead of just another sieve recipe or quest reward. But my personal favorite are the Archwood variants, with different island types themed around blazing, cascading, flourishing, and vexing Archwood. Each one has its own design, resource pool, and pack progression potential, which is why these rituals show up so often in skyblock style Ars progression. You definitely may recognize these from my ATM 10 TTS 100 days video, where I made great use of these to make the ATM star in just 100 Minecraft days. Once add-ons or custom pack designs get involved, this idea can go even further. You can have islands built around different biomes, different resources, different structures, or even progression milestones, which Enigmatic Skies has certainly already done, and there are a couple new packs coming in the future that I know plan to make great use of this mechanic. But Conjure Islands are only one side of the ritual system, and depending on the ritual, that might create a one-time effect, a temporary effect, or something that keeps running as long as it has what it needs. So while we won't look at all of them, some rituals are all about utility, like cloud shaping, which can change the weather, sunrise, which sets the time to day, or warping, which can move nearby entities to a linked location stored on a warp scroll. Those are not necessarily the flashiest, but they are useful in their own way. Then we have some other rituals that tie directly into automation and progression. Harvest can automatically harvest and replant crops in an area, and if there's an inventory next to the brazier, the drops can go there instead of just landing on the ground. Overgrowth accelerates crop growth in its effective area, which gets much more interesting once you start combining it with source generation farms and those magical helpers. And containment is the one that we teased earlier with the Drygmys setup. If you want to put mobs into containment jars, we need the ritual of containment. By luring or trapping mobs near the brazier and placing jars nearby, we can force those mobs into the jars and make our Drygmys very happy. That is one thing that Ars does pretty well. All of its systems keep connecting back into each other, providing all the tools you need to do pretty much anything. But rituals are not only useful for utility and automation, they can also be a little bit dangerous. And that brings us access to the Wilden Chimera. The Summon Wilden ritual by itself can summon Wilden enemies for a short duration, needed to farm all of the different Wilden drops that you'll use for crafting recipes along the way. But if we augment that ritual with a Wilden spike, a Wilden horn, and a Wilden wing, it changes into something much bigger. It summons the Wilden Chimera, which is basically the main boss fight of Ars Nouveau. Of course, be careful because the Wilden Chimera is definitely challenging, and it doesn't just damage you, it can also tear up the blocks around the area. But once you defeat it, you'll be rewarded with a Wilden tribute, which becomes a key ingredient for late game Ars progression, including things like the final tier spellbook and higher tier gear. So now we have source, rituals, boss progression, and the ingredients needed to push into the highest tier of Ars. But there's still one more Ars component that we haven't looked at yet, because if magic can replace tools, storage, world generation, and even parts of progression, can it replace machines too? In modded Minecraft, there is one thing that usually separates a magic mod from a tech mod: machines. Because it's one thing for magic to be useful, but it's another thing for magic to start doing the jobs normally handled by automated machines, factories, and processing lines. And Ars actually has a pretty strong answer for that before we even touch add-ons: spell turrets. Earlier in the video, we built spells for ourselves. I cast a spell, the spell does a thing, and then I move on. But a spell turret changes that relationship. Instead of the spell living only in my spellbook, I can essentially put that spell into the turret, give the turret source, and then activate it with redstone, which triggers the spell just as if it were being triggered by my spellbook. Basic spell turrets can use touch and projectile spells, and you can take that one step further by using enchanted spell turrets, which, while are a little bit more expensive to craft, instead cast those custom spells for just half the normal source cost. So let's take a look at an example. If I put a damage spell in here, I have a magical defense turret. Or if I instead put a break spell in here, I can turn this spell turret into an automatic cobblestone generator. And if the spell uses things like item pickup or place block, the turret can even interact with an inventory placed next to it, meaning you can make absolutely massive spells super customized to whatever automation goal you're trying to achieve. And as long as you have the source to back it up, you can fully automate it. And you can take that break spell turret one step further by adding conjure terrain, some AoE, a crush, and a smelt glyph to make a one block glass generator without even needing a normal cobble gen as a starting point, which is a pretty big shift. In a tech mod, you usually build a machine and configure what it does, where in Ars you build a spell that decide whether that spell belongs in your spellbook, in a turret, or eventually inside a larger automation setup. But base Ars Nouveau only pushes that idea so far. Once add-on mods get involved, the line between magic and machinery gets a lot blurrier. The first add-on I want to highlight is Ars Technica, and the idea here is extremely simple, but also extremely cool. What if spell glyphs could do the same kind of processing that create machines normally handle? For example, one of the clearest examples is Obliterate. Normally, Obliterate is exactly what it sounds like, a big arcane hammer effect. But when modified with the sensitive glyph, you can instead use this arcane hammer to simulate crushing items. So instead of putting an item through crushing wheels, I can instead use magic to perform a similar processing recipe directly in the world. And depending on the glyphs available in your version or mod pack, this can extend into other create processing methods too. Pressing, polishing, and other transformations can become spell-driven actions instead of the normal block-driven automation from create. Or the best example, Whirl, which you could use to simulate encased fans, allowing you to smelt, wash, blast, or haunt items with just a spell instead of needing a full fan and fluid setup. Now, to be clear, this does not mean that Ars Technica is trying to delete create from the scene. Instead, it lets Ars speak the same language as create. You can still build factories, but now magic can participate in those recipes. And that's exactly the kind of add-on support that makes Ars so powerful in modern mod packs, and is becoming an increasingly modern theme in some of the recent mod packs that I've played. But there is another add-on that pushes that relationship even further. Ars Creo goes in the other direction. Instead of only asking if spells can replace machines, instead it asks what happens when you use magic with machines. And the funniest example is probably the Starbuncle wheel, because yes, Ars can apparently take this adorable item moving squirrel from earlier and turn that energy into create stress units, which may be a bit questionable, but hey, if we entice our little squirrel friend with a gold block, he'll run even quicker, which might actually be worse. Once Ars and Create start talking to each other, you can start getting pretty advanced. Now, spell turrets can be placed on Create contraptions, timer turrets can fire spells on a configured interval, and source jars can also become part of contraptions, which means now you have all the tools you need to build moving mechanical contraptions that carry source along with it to cast spells as part of its operation. So is Ars Nouveau Minecraft's most complete magic mod? Honestly, I think it has one of the strongest cases. Ars provides a strong framework for spellcasting, progression, automation, storage, world manipulation, animation, or boss progression. And with add-ons, it can stretch even further into magical technology. But now, I want to hear what you think. What mod do you think challenges Ars Nouveau for that title? And of course, leave your suggestions for future Mod Labs episodes down in the comments, because some of your comments actually helped lead to this video. Also, don't forget to subscribe, so you don't miss some of the awesome new videos I have planned coming out soon. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.